Thank you for joining us today, everyone. If you're in the room right now, then I'm sure you know who the person who is joining us today is. But just in case you do not, he is a composer, producer, and engineer who has spent the last 20 years releasing and making music that consistently challenges perceptions and genre boundaries. His home base is here in Iceland at the Greenhouse Studios. Please join me in welcoming Valgeir Sigurðsson. We have a lot of music to discuss because you've had a very extensive career. But before we start to talk about some of the music that you've made, I'd like to play something that I understand was particularly transformative for you as a listener in setting you on your musical path today. And it might be a little bit unexpected for people, but let's take a listen to this song. So, that was obviously Prince, When Doves Cry. Can you take me back to the first time that you heard that song and maybe explain why it was so transformative for you?
I think I heard it first in the film Purple Rain, and that was sort of my introduction to Prince when I was maybe 13, and that was a time in my life where I had been studying electric guitar and playing electric guitar and playing like rock and punk music and starting to get more interested in electronics and electronic music and music production. And I remember seeing that film and seeing the musicians use drum machines on stage and guitars and everything in combination. And and I remember there was a sequence in the film where Prince is writing a piece of music and just like turns on like an angry moment or something, turns on a drum machine and just plays along and shit, don't need a drummer. So I think that was one of the things that I've watched that film maybe 1,000,000 times, and every little detail about it I was kind of obsessed with at that time in my life, and I picked this song, I think, as one. I could have picked any from that record because I lived it basically, and it was different to a lot of the music that I had been listening to, I guess, up till that point.
What had your musical references been separately, as a guitarist and just as a listener as well?
Yeah, well, that was also but sort of before that it was more straight rock with the guitars, and Class and Sex Pistols were a big favorite of mine, and that was the kind of the music that I had been trying to play as a 9 and 10-year-old, and then opening my ears to bands like Japan and Talk Talk, who were using more synths and the new romantic electronic music of the 80s coming in.
At the time that you were studying music and playing guitar, did it mean anything to you that Prince was not only the guitarist but the composer and the mixer and the engineer, was basically this one-man band? What did that mean to you as something that potentially gave you the idea of what you could aspire to in multiple roles in music, as opposed to being limited to just one?
Yeah, that was a big part of why I think I was attracted to this this film and this way of music making with people and with machines, and growing up where I did grow up in the north of Iceland with about 1,000 people living there. I didn't have musicians to play with a lot of the time, so the technology was very new at the time and not so accessible as it is today, obviously. But I wanted to play the guitar as an instrument, but I knew that I wouldn't necessarily want to be a guitar player, but I wanted to make music. So at the time I was starting to understand that producing music in the studio would be a way to do things that wouldn't limit one to be in a band and just being in that role of the guitarist or a specific corner, you know, and being able to write and produce in your bedroom almost, you know, that was a very attractive idea for me.
Do you remember what your earliest setup might have been when you actually started to produce music on your own before you actually went to study?
Yeah, I started buying a Roland drum machine, I remember. It was a 707. And then I got another Roland keyboard. It was JX3 that I actually still have today. I don't have the 707, but those machines were with the guitar I was using. Actually, before that, I had a neighbor who had a home organ with preset drums, and I took a tape machine over and recorded the drums from the rock, bossa nova, samba, jazz, at 3 different tempos, so I could play along to them. So that was like before I was able to buy a drum machine in a way to kind of have that at hand. So I was kind of playing around with tape and recording.
At what point did you take this informal education and interest into a more formal realm and started to study engineering? Was it in London?
Yeah, well, then I moved to Reykjavík when I was about 15, and then I started studying classical guitar as well around the same time, and my interest had also kind of opened for classical music. Also having a sister who was playing the piano and playing classical pieces, I was intrigued by that music. That was sort of my first exposure to classical music. And then the engineering, I saw an ad in the paper one day, and it said free studio time. Come and record your demo. So I went, and I had been writing songs in my room, and went to this small basement studio that belonged to a guy who was formerly in a band and had now sort of lost interest in the studio a bit, but he was getting clients in, so you only have to pay him for his time, and so I did that and came out with 4 demos or something like that, and then he actually started asking me. He kind of picked up on my curiosity about the studio environment, so he asked me to. So I had come to Reykjavík to study, and like after to go into like a grammar school, but I wasn't really interested in that. So actually, I was more interested in the studio, and he picked up on this, and he said, "You could come and help me out if you want." And so I started coming to his studio, and suddenly I found myself in a place with equipment, with microphones, with a 12-track tape recorder, a mixing desk, some outboard equipment, and I could help him out and like spend the evenings like making my music. And eventually, 6 months later or so, it had become a job, and I actually quit school to do that job. So
And this was still in Reykjavik?
this is still in Reykjavik. This is like, let's see, this is 87.
Is the guy still around?
I think he is, but he's not in the studio. So this was his like getting out of the studio business, was like selling me the equipment when I was 17 and leaving me there basically with a recording studio to run and to have as my. I actually was living next door to it, so it was the kind of the beginning of how I'm still running Greenhouse. So this is 30 years ago. And then 2 years later, I actually decided that I would need to go and study a bit more formally and live somewhere else. And so I applied to go to the SAE in London, and where I studied music production and engineering.
separate from the actual education component of your time in London, were there any specific musical experiences that you had there in the city that you might not have had access to had you stayed in Reykjavik, in terms of things that further expand musical reference points or something like that?
Yeah, I think it's just also a part of growing up and not just as a musical experience or just seeing a different community and a different, like, being away and learning to live on your own and all that. It's an important part of the education, like learning about life. I wanted to stay in London longer and try to get a job there, but that didn't work out. So I ended up coming back, and I had sold the equipment. So it was kind of a transition for me. Like, I'd been able to kind of support myself with the studio work and doing, like, editing radio commercials and doing band demos and this and that, and writing my own music kind of in my spare time and playing with friends. But I think it was a really important time for me to go away and come back, and just how you kind of see the place that you're from in a different perspective when you return, and when you're away. You appreciate the things maybe that you forget about when you're in the middle of it.
So would you say that the lessons from this time spent studying music were not actually as important for you in terms of what they were teaching you about the gear or the electronics or the process? It was more about creating this mindset of you having this sort of musical life.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that I was slightly underwhelmed with the course because the amount of practical studio time was quite limited. And it was in the day where access to there were a few computers in the school, but there was one main control room, and you kind of had to book it out months in advance. So, and then you had to find people to bring into the studio. So there wasn't really, I mean, sort of kind of in retrospect, you learn survival. So you just have to make the best of it that you can. But I think the overall experience was very positive and useful. Where, like, nothing was kind of handed to you; you had to figure it out.
And then you came back to Iceland. You were playing in bands. At what point did you decide to create Greenhouse, where you're still working today? Because it sounds like it was partially in reaction to these experiences that you had, but also building upon the positive. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think that it stayed with me, having access to the equipment, and I had kept some of the equipment and mostly the instruments and the things that I could carry with me, and going into studios for every project was not something that I liked. I missed not having the access to, like, having and being able to invite people to come and use the space and collaborate. So I started collecting more gear a bit more deliberately and having a little setup that enabled me to eventually get a space and get a bit more serious about it, because this is again, I don't know if everybody remembers the time before computers. Like, we're so used to it now that it was much more of a thing, to get a dedicated tape recorder, not a machine that does everything, your email and everything else, and you make music on it as well. I was kind of slow to get into computers because they always felt very, very counterproductive to me. Like, they didn't move as fast as I wanted them to move. They didn't have any memory. They didn't, you know, you think so much faster than they react to, whereas now they're starting to become, you know, good tools. So, you know, collecting the gear and setting up a space was something that I wanted to do again.
When the first people were coming out to Greenhouse, I guess at that time you were mainly producing other people's work.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember what the reaction was to the space, being the type of studio that it is, in the location that it is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it wasn't in the location and wasn't the space from the beginning. So I started in a slightly more humble setting, and with the equipment was very like collected from here and there in a makeshift sort of space with a, you know, in an industrial park, and the name Greenhouse actually comes from that sort of idea of having a greenhouse of ideas in this kind of concrete landscape, whereas the greenhouse where it is today and has been for the last 18 years isn't a very green area. But the reaction, people were just happy to come to a space where they could make noise and record and have a good quality outcome. And it was sort of more about those connections than necessarily about the gear or about the space.
So between Greenhouse was founded in 1997 in the first location, and then in 2006 was the first record that came out on Bedroom Community. What was happening in your musical life during that 10-year span, basically, that led you to the moment of deciding to found the label? Separate from any sort of meeting Nico or Ben, I'm curious about the musical progression during that time that made it seem sensible.
Yeah, well, before starting Greenhouse in the beginning, I had been playing with a few different bands and different local acts that toured a bit and had records out, and so kind of learning about it from that side as well. You know, being certainly a keyboard player in a band and touring and then, you know, I being the one who would kind of produce the recording if I can or engineer it, and then those collaborations kind of led to the studio coming together as a space, and then I was in the beginning I was working quite a lot with the Bad Taste label, Smekklesa, who would always like ask me occasionally to do a project, and it was a group of people who had kind of similar interests in music making, I guess, and yeah, I think that. What was the question? What happened until the label?
Why was it suddenly a good idea to have the label in 2006 if it didn't seem like such a good idea in 2003 or 2000 or 1997 when you first started?
Well, I didn't start thinking about the label until, well, I guess I started thinking about it in the early 2000s. I had sometimes come across projects that I wanted to be involved with that didn't have a label. So in the end, it was like, well, we can't really put all this effort into it if nobody's going to hear it. It seems a little bit wrong to do that, and my instinct is usually to just figure things out and to do them, rather than try to kind of find, for example, the right label for each project. I thought when I wanted to get my own music released, I should just release it myself. So that's where I started seriously thinking about having a label, because I had the studio, I had the kind of infrastructure to make the records and the ideas to make the music, but I don't know. It's kind of where I come from. Is that like this do-it-yourself way of thinking?
I actually want to play an excerpt of something from the very first release on Bedroom Community. It's 12 minutes long, so we're not going to listen to the entire thing. But this is an excerpt of Nico Muhly's Keep in Touch. This is on Speaks Volumes, which it was the first release, yes? So that was the last 5 minutes of Keep in Touch. If you haven't heard it, go listen to the full album. You produced that for Nico.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there's sort of a funny story I've read of Nico describing you wanting to produce that record, based off of how terrible it sounded when he first sent it to you.
Yeah, no, he sent me when we were starting to get to know each other. He was this assistant to Philip Glass in the Looking Glass studio, which is his former headquarters in New York, and I was working there as well. And he was sort of sneaking around, and we started talking, and I asked him to send me some of his music because he talked about it, and he sent me these recordings, and apologizing for them being recorded just with one microphone somewhere in the ceiling and in a performance, and it's like, yeah, this is great music, but this we can't have it sounding like this. It deserves better than this. And he was immediately into the idea that we would just do it and make a good version of these pieces.
And separate from just improving that particular release, when you were listening to other modern classical music, did you have an idea in your head of how you wanted to change the way it was produced and presented?
I don't know if I listen to music or look at things always with the eye I wanted to changing them, but I have an idea of how I might want to do it. Not necessarily like I want to do new music, but with this particular record, I thought recording these classical instruments in a way that we kind of approached them in pop or rock music would not be a sin to try it.
Can you break down what that means?
Well,
for
it means
people who might not know the difference between the typical recording?
Exactly. So what is the traditional way of recording? It tends to be like you have a big group of people playing, but maybe 3 or 6 microphones or something, and you're kind of trying to capture the room as if it were a live performance. So you try to optimize the space that you're playing in, or you do it really quickly, and you try to edit together a few good takes, and that's it. The other way to do it is to go into the studio and map out the piece, layer it instrument by instrument sometimes, and take a lot of care with how you place the mics and how you treat each recording, and in my case, in this at this time, I was kind of I had been getting very much interested in getting a lot closer to the source of the sound than traditionally you would get in a room recording. So I was exploring a lot of very extreme close miking and having rather than recording things in a stereo overhead pair, would record them with one mic like this close and another one out there, and then I would balance it to sound like something that I was hearing, and to get maybe some nuances that I was missing. And in this piece that we heard, Keep in Touch, it was actually recorded. A lot of the percussion elements are from the viola, so sampled sounds of her like doing stuff to the viola that you're not supposed to do. And so that's Nadia Soroda, and that's the first time we recorded together. And I found that how I wasn't used to maybe classical people coming from the classical world being that kind of excited and open to that experimentation process, and maybe not. They're always kind of trained to conceal the imperfections of their instruments, and you play into a beautiful sounding space, hoping that nobody will hear the the scratchy sound of the strings, or whereas there we would go and amplify those sounds, you know.
And even though they're all sonically different, I think there's a really strong connection between those first 3 releases on Bedroom Community, which was the one we just listened to, Speaks Volumes, Ben Frost, and then your own Equilibrium. But they're definitely not in the same genre of music. So what do you think is sort of the uniting factor for this music, if there would be something separate from genre? Because I think they're sort of too connected to feel like they're completely disparate.
Yeah, I think there's some kind of an aesthetic that we shared at the time and still probably do, that that filtered through, and the fact that they're recorded and mixed in the same space, and you know, we're all kind of involved in them in some way, even though, you know, in very different capacities, of course. But and I felt that there was a strong connection between the way the 3 of us approached our music making, and I felt that it worked perfectly together as the first 3 releases on the same label. I think that's as far as I can go in explaining what it is. It was just a feeling.
How much of the way that you approach music making has changed from your first solo release to now?
I think it has changed a lot, probably. But I think
I'm curious. Are you composing? Are you writing on the same instruments as you were then? Is your notation process completely different?
You know, it's funny that actually I feel like almost everything before Bedroom Community was an exercise, you know, and I feel like it was education almost. Like maybe setting up Bedroom Community, starting that my own. It was like my graduation, like my thesis or something, my big project, and then like now life happens, and now you're on your own, and now it's like now it's the real life, the real world, and I think that it's changed in ways that maybe I think I approached projects in a maybe a slightly more relaxed way, and you know, I've matured, I hope, as both as a composer and as someone who guides other people through their process. I definitely spend less time in the studio than I used to. I think about music probably more than I used to. I don't know if that makes sense. It's so there's always something going on, but I'm physically less there because I think I know I go quicker through, maybe. Like there's and not to say that I always know what I'm going for, or what there's not experimentation anymore. Not at all. I think that there's still a big part of my process is sitting and trying and like editing and like I work a lot with reduction. Like I pile a lot of stuff in, and then I spend a lot of time like sifting through it and just taking it apart and putting it back together and throwing out stuff and cleaning it up. Whereas the composition happens pretty fluidly and rapidly. I think that's how. Yeah, that's probably just development. I don't know if I can put my finger on a shift from the. It's just a gradual.
You've also had to write music that was commissioned by other people. I guess your second and your third albums were both created with a different work in mind initially. Mm-hmm. What sort of challenges does that present to have to fit your music to some other entity entirely? I guess it was a ballet for the third, and
Yeah.
then a film for the second, or vice versa.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and they're different projects, and there are different challenges actually in each case. For me, the positive is having almost someone else like waiting for the music, to happen, and it being contextualized in some way, and there being a concept to the music. Architecture of Loss, this dance piece by Stephen Petronio and his dance company. All I had for that was the title. So he gave me the title, and then I could run with it. And we discussed basically what that title meant to me, what it meant to him, what he thought about when he thought about that, those words put together.
So he was going to create a dance piece that was however long your music was, just based off of that title? Or was there more restrictions?
No, the length was actually, it was supposed to be about maximum 40 minutes. And that's just the program that he had to work with. And I could write music in that. The other restriction in that project was that and that was new for me because I had to construct it for live performance, because we performed the music with the dance in the beginning, in the first run, and we could only have 3 people. Whereas before I'd been working with kind of unlimited, and always like thinking the live performance afterwards. So it was one of the first, at least big pieces that I wrote for a specific number of people in mind, and then had to kind of, had to work within that frame. Whereas Dreamland was a film that had big themes and big subjects, and we wanted the music to be quite expansive and orchestral in parts, and never really thinking about the live, if that music would be played live, which it has been since quite a lot, and with orchestras of sizes from like 26 to 60. So those versions were created afterwards, but the project was built kind of in this studio approach where I get small sections in and layered them together, and then.
But that a sense of adaptability seems so important in general, the ability to take this restriction and sort of create something from it, or have something very small and then build it out further and further. And I think that sort of threads through a lot of your work.
Yeah, it does. And this is one of the things that Nico, especially in the beginning when we were doing Speaks Volumes, then we were like his background being in the performance, writing for performance, and mine in writing for studio, and then combining that, we then started making different versions of the pieces to perform with whoever was around. If Nadia was around to play the viola, then we'd play certain pieces, and then I would do electronics, and the electronics would maybe include like half of the pre-recorded tracks, and I would figure out a way to make those electronics feel live and interactive for me, to not just stand there pressing a button, So so I think that kind of reverse engineering the recording and the writing, and kind of crossing it in all ways possible, was and is an important thing of my work.
I want to play something from Dreamland, the title track. I think I might butcher the title if I try to pronounce the Icelandic, the Dreamlanded. I guess that's okay.
It's pretty bad.
Yeah.
No, it's pretty good.
I warned you, but this is Dreamland. So that was Dreamland, and I think there's an interesting environmental aspect to you making this score specifically that I sort of want to unpack, because it's the film itself is about Alcoa, the former aluminum company of America, and their plants for aluminum or iron on the Icelandic coast.
Yeah, the damming project that was sort of in the east. And well, that's kind of, yeah, one of the part of this film is about that. I think, I mean, it's based on a book that is about general kind of exploitation of resources and of nature and corporations kind of taking advantage of small communities, and like how much do we value this the land that we have versus like a short-term profit that we could make from one of these projects.
How do you translate something like that into music? Because it's not just about writing to the film at that point. It's very complex topics, and that you sort of have to reflect musically in some way. And
I mean, you heard this dramatic piece of music there, and I guess a lot of the fun thing about working on that film was it's a lot of talking heads, a lot of people like on both sides of the argument, for and against, like these projects and these dams and in these in between, sort of you're given time to consider a little bit what's going on, what have these people been saying, and we see a lot of landscape, we see a lot of nature, and often in these moments the music was kind of playing with those scenes, and the sadness in it is that a lot of it is landscape and nature that has been drowned for creating these big dams, and I don't know, I didn't find it difficult at all to find to make music that illustrated that sadness, that tragedy in a way that I think, yeah, it wasn't a hard thing. I guess my natural instinct is I mean, it's harder for me to write a happy piece of music than it is to write a sad piece of music.
Is that subject, when you think about Bedroom Community as being a label that is, first of all, based in Iceland, on an island, and then has to create, presumably, a large amount of vinyl, which is a petroleum product. I'm curious if you've thought about that in relation to the label, after you had to have that experience thinking about it in relation to the country overall.
Yeah, obviously, think about it all the time. Lose sleep over it, you know. It is what it is, I guess. We're in a kind of a weird time in history, with all these sort of products, and music is moving into the digital world, which has no, or well, it probably does have a carbon footprint in some ways, that you have power hungry hard drives everywhere and so on, but this thing about manufacturing plastic and projects made from, you know, fossil fuels is not something that we necessarily. I mean, if there was another way, I don't think we're going to stop producing them while people still want them. And I love vinyl, you know, and I don't think that vinyl is responsible for destroying the planet on its own. But
I don't think it is either. But I think it's interesting to think about in the context of that other film score.
It is, and I think that what kind of bothers me even more is all the shipping and freight and like and then the fact that we have to bring all this. We don't manufacture it here, so we have to have stock sent all over the world from different places, and the quantities are so low at this point of time that you don't have like a plant in every territory. You just manufacture, and then you kind of hope to get these copies out into the world, and you have to, like, the price doesn't reflect the manufacturing cost and the shipping cost and so on. So it's all like kind of a weird, in a weird place right now.
I think your latest release also reflects being aware of these sorts of contradictions. It's the album Dissonance, which actually last night, if you haven't heard, won the Icelandic Music Award for Best Album. This was your first album. Dissonance was your first album in 5 years. It came out last year.
Yeah.
What was happening during that period that made you want to move away from focusing on producing other people's work so heavily and pursue more of your solo compositions and really focus on that? Was there one thing in particular, or was it an accumulation of different experiences that you can talk about?
It's an accumulation for sure, but in that time, it's not like Dissonance came out 5 years after and I didn't make any music or write any music in the meantime. All that music took a long time to write, and I think the earliest piece is probably an orchestral commission from 2011, 2012 maybe. And I was writing much more music and kind of to the point where I didn't even have the time to kind of put it into an album format or release it or sort of put it in a context like that. So actually that's development that is both conscious and I think a natural progression. And then I had 2.5 years ago I had twins, so life kind of changes and the way that you appreciate the time that you have and I've always wanted to. Actually, I forgot to tell you earlier that after I left, when I was leaving London, I actually applied to go to composition school. So I never got formal composition education. I learned how to read and write music playing guitar, but
I think it ended up okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still making music, more music than ever before, so that's fine. I just figured out my own way to do it. But this was always the intention. It was always the direction. But I tend to kind of do things on my own speed, and the reason for focusing less, like putting the focus more into my writing music and producing more with the closest collaborators on Bedroom Community is also is this time is precious, and I feel like I've kind of done that enough for the moment. Maybe I'll get back into that role more heavily. I don't know. I can't see it at the moment, but it's a very different energy, and you have to, and you feel like you're kind of organizing other people's lives a lot of the time, and their thoughts and their emotions and their kind of expectations. And Bedroom Community operates in a slightly different way. The projects are usually always ongoing, and I'm kind of dip my toe into many during 1 week. I might like touch on it, like send updates and versions to the artists and get feedback, and it sort of develops until the music is ready. There might be like a week of like intense recording, and then it sits on my hard drive, and I work on it here and there. and a little bit how I work on my music as well. I might have a project that I have to like put all my energy into, and then it goes somewhere, and then in the meantime I'm kind of working on 6 other things, and that's just very much how So I like having these open conversations going and collaborations all the time with all these different people, and writing for commissions and doing work in the theater or film, or this seems like it's how I enjoy making music at the moment.
And Dissonance as well was another piece of music that came from a concept in your head before the actual process of composition started. Can you talk about what that was for the title track?
Yes, the piece Dissonance is based on 45 seconds of a Mozart string quartet.
How long is the string quartet total, the original?
It's under 10 minutes. But this is the first of 4 movements, and it's an interesting piece because it's so different to everything that he had written. It sounds, if you listen to it, it sounds a lot more like Shostakovich or something much closer in time. That's why it got the name Dissonance Quartet, because people were not really used to, at that time, hearing those. But it moves very fast in the original, and when I heard it for the first time, I was like, well, I love how these dissonant chords come together really quickly and then resolve into something more kind of consonant, and I wanted to kind of extend these moments. I wanted to live them and like sit in them for minutes, at a time. So I just took the score and I stretched it to about I think it plays at about 2 BPM, something like that. So it's 23 minutes the piece now. No, 11 BPM was the what we figured out that we recorded it at. It was lower than the computer could go, so we had to divide it. I think we did it at 22. It would only go down to 20 BPM. So so that was basically the starting point for the piece. Just kind of exploding these bars into and like sustaining those moments, and kind of reconstructing the piece with Liam Byrne, who is the viola da gamba player that I built the piece with. He plays all the strings on the piece, and we did like layers and layers and layers of him playing for 25 minutes at a time. So it took many days just to get all the layers in. And sometimes we discovered that we had to redo a layer because when was sitting against something else, something new, then or maybe a part of a layer we had to kind of redo. And then my process after that, after the recording, was to shape it again. The dynamics, like which one of these 20-something layers, what was the most prominent one? What was the kind of chords? What was the lead? So on. And reprocess them, reamping them into guitar amps and distorting, and
Do you find yourself being more interested in that sort of sprawl nowadays as opposed to concision, or do you not think there's really a distinction between them, and it was just the case for this one?
Well, I think these long form pieces, I'm more comfortable with them for sure, but I don't know. I think it goes both ways, really.
What makes you more comfortable with them, though?
I think it's just that I think I have a better understanding of what I can see kind of further and into the future. When starting a piece like that, that is that long, you know, that you have to. And actually playing it live, we played it a lot. Just the two of us live. Actually, it kind of makes you understand the piece and rediscover it in a way. And the fun thing for me when I play it live is that I'm always reworking the dynamics of it, and it can go many ways. And I think it can sound, at least to me, it can sound quite different from one performance to the next.
Let's listen to a few minutes of this. This is Dissonance from 2017. So that's the first 5 minutes of a 22 minutes. You should go listen to it if you haven't. And I think that that beautiful piece of music is actually a good ending point. So thank you very much for coming out today. We're going to open it up to a Q&A. If people have questions, there should be a microphone that's floating around.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering regarding structures of songs and the music you make. What is your kind of approach to structure?
Structure is very important for me, but I don't know that I have a clear answer, because I think I always rely on my instincts, and one of the challenges is with kind of longer pieces is that you have to. I think it's the journey has to make sense, and it can be tricky to see if the structure is good or bad. Looking at it, you have to kind of be able to zoom out, and yeah, that's my only answer.
Thanks.
Was there anyone else?
I actually have a question, if that's all right.
Go for it.
How important are reference tracks for you during mixing and mastering?
I guess less and less. You can learn a lot from listening to. If you're just thinking about the mastering process or the mixing of a track, then of course it helps to have something that you know is tried and tested, and you listen to in your car, and you listen to in the club, and you listen to on the radio, you listen to on your laptop speakers, and like, well, this always sounds good. So you can measure things up against. But then I guess I don't think they're. I hardly ever use them anymore. But I think I used to. Just to convince myself that I couldn't get this any further, you know, like there can't be any more bass in this. There can't be, like, this can't be louder. This can't be. So. But then actually, I mean, my reference tracks these days tend to be my stuff that I worked on, because also I can kind of very easily. Or more easily, I can analyze it in my head, and I can remember what the process was. For example, I think "By the Throat," Ben Frost's album, I think we mastered that 5 times or something. And in my opinion, it's a mastering that I think brought as much to the way the record sounds as the mixing. I mixed it as well, but the mastering actually kind of really pushed it forward, and that's an album that I go back to sometimes.
If there's not anyone else, then we'll wrap up. But thank you again for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.